They were terrified of their own bodies long before anyone dared to say it aloud. A single drop of sweat could ruin a reputation. A stray scent could be treated like moral decay. And a man's skin felt more like a threat than a home. Beneath elegant suits and polished colognes lived a quiet panic that shaped everything they touched and everything they hid. Tonight, we walk into that world and feel the fear that never made it into the history books. So, before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Only if your heart truly wants to. If you do like it, leave a little comment letting me know what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights. Adjust the pillow to fit your head. Maybe turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere. And let's begin this journey together tonight. If one tried to understand why Victorian men clung so tightly to the idea of cleanliness, the explanation would not be found in hygiene, but in something far more uneasy. Their lives unfolded in a world where the body was viewed as a threat, not a natural part of existence. Cleanliness became less about washing away dirt and more about silencing the fear that their own skin might betray them. In towns filled with steam, coal dust, and narrow alleys, the body carried meanings heavier than sweat or grime. It carried the weight of morality, and for many men, that weight felt unbearable. A man walking down a crowded London street did not worry first about soot staining his coat. He worried about the faint trace of himself lingering beneath the fabric. Clothing was layered not only for warmth, but to create barriers between skin and air, between scent and judgment, between what he felt and what he allowed the world to perceive. In that sense, daily grooming was an act of self-defense. Every gesture, from brushing the collar to adjusting a cravat, tried to conceal the fear that the body underneath was capable of revealing too much. Beneath this anxiety lay an idea long embedded in Victorian thought, that bodily odour was a sign of moral weakness. A healthy man, they believed, should emit nothing except self-control, mysterious vapours, spiritual energies, and theories from untested medical texts blended to shape public belief. Anything that smelled strongly was seen as evidence of impulses that society demanded be tamed. Men learned to distrust their own physicality because the body did not obey social rules. It sweated. It heated. It reacted without permission. It betrayed. Some tried to fix this unease with rigid routines. A shallow wash in cold water each morning was meant to stiffen the mind as much as the skin. The shock was intentional. It promised control. Towels were scrubbed against the body with more force than necessary, as though friction could erase the inconvenient fact that human beings are not scentless creatures. Afterward came powders and lotions, tiny shields disguised as personal care. These practices were repeated not because they worked, but because repetition itself brought comfort. The contradiction grew sharper in private spaces, in bedrooms lit by dim lamps. A man might undress without daring to pause. The air between his shirt and his chest felt like a witness. He watched his own movements with suspicion, afraid that a single moment of relaxation could allow the natural odour of living flesh to escape. Bedsheets were replaced frequently, or perfumed, until they no longer smelled of anything human. The goal was simple: eliminate reminders that the body existed beyond clothing and discipline. Even medical advice encouraged this mindset. Pamphlets insisted that bodily scent revealed inner corruption, warning that uncontrolled aroma indicated a disordered mind. Physicians, relying on flawed theories, told their patients that odour travelled directly from nerves weakened by immoral thoughts. This belief transformed an ordinary bodily function into a moral test. Men reacted by tightening their routines further and inventing new ways to distance themselves from their own bodies. It would be strange today to imagine someone recoiling from the faintest sign of sweat on his skin. But in Victorian society, this was entirely ordinary. The fear did not come from the odour itself, but from what people believed the odour meant. In parlours, clubs, and offices, A man's scent became a silent announcement of his character. Those who smelled too strongly, whether from labor, heat, or simpler nature, were judged as lacking discipline. Even the suggestion of musk could suggest a lack of self-mastery. Public environments intensified the anxiety. On trains, men kept handkerchiefs perfumed with light citrus or mint, holding them discreetly near their faces whenever someone sat too close. In meeting rooms, chairs were spaced with care. Ventilation was praised not for health reasons, but because it reduced the risk of discovering something personal about the men who shared the space. Scent became a social boundary, invisible but powerful. In poorer neighborhoods, the conflict deepened. Bathing facilities were scarce, and cleanliness was measured more by intention than by water. Even so, expectations remained harsh. Men who could not access perfumes or powders improvised with herbs or cheap colognes that stung the skin. The goal was always the same: erase the self. The irony was that these efforts often made the scent sharper, creating the very effect they hoped to avoid. Advertising amplified the fear. Posters promised that certain mixtures could protect a man's reputation, shielding him from shame. These claims worked because they tapped directly into the quiet panic already present. Powder was not purchased for pleasure. It was purchased because the alternative felt dangerous. Companies understood that men longed for assurance, not fragrance. What they sold was reassurance disguised as polish. Inside families, the same pressure lingered. Fathers instructed sons in how to hide their natural odor long before teaching them other aspects of adulthood. A young boy standing nervously in front of a mirror learned that growing up meant learning to pretend. The body was something to control, not understand. He entered the world wearing the lessons of fear taught to him by a culture that could not accept its own physicality. This burden shaped relationships as well. Some men avoided intimacy because they feared that proximity would expose them. Others remained emotionally distant, as though allowing someone too close would reveal the truth they worked so hard to conceal. It was a quiet isolation, rarely spoken, rarely admitted, but deeply felt. The obsession formed a cycle. Fear led to avoidance. Avoidance reinforced shame, and shame deepened the fear. Victorian society built ideals around restraint, expecting men to act as though they were made of clean cloth instead of living flesh. And in that process, countless men learned to mistrust the simplest realities of their own existence. Men did not chase cleanliness for health. They chased it to escape the discomfort of feeling human in a world that punished humanity. The effort was constant, exhausting, and invisible. An entire system built upon quiet panic. In the end, everything in their routines revealed how fear shaped the way they treated their own bodies. And nothing about that fear was accidental. The ideas waiting beyond these early habits were already pushing them toward more rigid beliefs about morality and scent. Something deeper was forming beneath their polished appearance, preparing to twist even the most ordinary bodily function into a sign of inner disorder. Victorian medicine carried an uneasiness that turned the human body into a suspect long before any symptom appeared. In that climate, a man's scent became more than something physical. It became a sign that observers believed they could read like a warning. Physicians wrote confidently about theories built on guesswork, insisting that odor rose from impulses that lacked restraint. A faint smell was interpreted as weakness, while anything stronger was treated as evidence of something animalistic beneath the surface. It was a judgment that settled over daily life, quietly, shaping how men viewed themselves long before anyone else spoke. Medical pamphlets warned that certain forms of bodily smell revealed lower desires. Even though no scientific foundation supported such claims, the belief fit neatly into the moral anxieties of the era, and so it spread without resistance. Men who worked in factories or spent long hours in workshops had no way to escape the scent that naturally clung to labor. But the scent itself was treated as a flaw. not a condition. The stigma did not distinguish between effort and indulgence. It simply rested on the skin of whoever carried it. To be perceived as odorless was to be perceived as morally composed. These ideas filtered into conversations in quiet, unspoken ways. A passing comment, an observation about the warmth of a room or the closeness of air, could be enough to make someone check their collar, their coat, or the space beneath their arms. No one wanted to be the person whose scent exposed something supposedly hidden. Even without explicit accusation, the fear grew. Men adapted their lives to avoid giving others the chance to make those silent judgments. Ventilated rooms, perfumed handkerchiefs, and layers of clothing weren't simply habits of etiquette. They were tools to distance themselves from implications they did not want attached to their names. Doctors reinforced these pressures with warnings packaged as advice. They claimed that a strong bodily odor indicated an interior imbalance, a phrase vague enough to mean anything but alarming enough to matter. Some texts suggested that scent escaped when thoughts lost discipline, merging morality with biology. A man experiencing stress or frustration could easily be led to believe that his emotions were leaking into the air around him. The language encouraged self-surveillance, turning ordinary existence into something monitored and corrected. Scent, in this atmosphere, became a marker of status. The wealthy were expected to smell refined, as though personal virtue rose naturally from the skin. Their access to soaps, powders, and scented oils helped maintain that illusion. The poor, meanwhile, carried the unavoidable evidence of daily labor, and society interpreted that scent as a sign of lesser character rather than harsher conditions. The judgment was not simply about odor, it was about hierarchy. A man's smell determined how others imagined his thoughts, his desires, and even his intentions. Because odor was linked with the idea of sinful impulses, perfume gained a role far beyond aesthetics. Men did not apply fragrance to please others or to express style. They applied it to hide a danger that society told them resided within themselves. A bottle of cologne became a form of moral armor, reassuring the wearer that no one would suspect any inner disorder. Some used it sparingly, while others relied on it until the scent clung to every layer of their clothing. The goal was not pleasure, it was concealment. These expectations pushed men further from their own bodies. They learned to anticipate scrutiny, adjusting how they moved and how closely they stood near others. A conversation became something measured in inches rather than words. In tight spaces, carriages, stairwells, crowded halls, the fear intensified. Every breath felt like a risk. An innocent change in expression from another person could be misread as silent judgment. The body became a source of tension, even when no one else was watching. This pressure shaped private rituals as well. Men spent long minutes checking collars, cuffs, and underlayers for any trace of scent. Clothing was washed repeatedly, even when the fabric weakened. Some placed herbs beneath their shirts, hoping to create a barrier between skin and air. Others used powders meant for entirely different purposes, trusting anything that promised dryness or cover. The routines were not about comfort. They were about maintaining distance from a part of themselves they had been taught to distrust. In public institutions, churches, schools, and offices, the same expectations remained. A man entering a quiet room often instinctively inhaled through his nose, testing the air not for freshness, but for the reassurance that nothing disturbing came from him. The pressure was heavy enough that some avoided gatherings altogether, choosing isolation over the possibility of being silently condemned. Moral suspicion made the body feel unsafe, even when illness or dirt had nothing to do with the situation. The tension between appearance and reality created a constant background strain. Men who followed every rule could still feel uncertain. They lived in a world that interpreted natural human scent as evidence of something uncontrolled, and the absence of smell became a requirement for social acceptance. Nothing about this expectation aligned with nature, yet it held firm because it fit the fears of the time. Victorian society preferred illusions of purity over acknowledging that the body had its own logic. As these beliefs deepened, men became increasingly dependent on the tools that promised safety. Perfumes, powders, and tightly structured clothing. What society called grooming often functioned more like a quiet attempt to silence the physical world. Odor became not a fact of life, but a symbol of everything people wanted to avoid thinking about: desire, instinct, and the simple reality that no one could fully control their own body. Everything in these beliefs showed how scent was turned into a judgment rather than a condition, reshaping how men understood themselves. A new layer of pressure soon emerged, as society demanded that every trace of masculinity be hidden beneath artificial refinement. And somewhere in that growing silence, the fear of being exposed began to shape the most private corners of daily life. The ideal of the spotless gentleman did not appear suddenly. It formed quietly through daily judgments that shaped how men understood their place in society. In crowded streets and cramped rooms, scent became an invisible marker, used to distinguish refinement from hardship. A man who carried even the faintest trace of sweat risked being grouped with those considered uneducated or disorderly. The divide was not based on character, but on how well one could mask the physical reality of living. Cleanliness, in this context, became a performance rather than a condition. The pressure to embody this ideal influenced every aspect of appearance. Clothing was chosen not only for its style, but for its ability to conceal the body beneath it. Wool, linen, and tightly woven cotton were layered to prevent warmth and scent from escaping. The structure of the garments created a distance between skin and air, allowing a man to appear composed even when he felt restless. Tailors became silent partners in maintaining this illusion, designing garments that restricted movement but reinforced the outward impression of restraint. In social gatherings, a gentleman's presence was measured by what could not be detected. Silence from his skin was considered proof of discipline. The absence of odor was treated not merely as hygienic success, but as moral evidence. A man who remained odorless, even in a crowded room, was thought to have mastered himself. Expectations grew so strict that any deviation felt like failure. The ideal demanded an almost unnatural stillness, an expectation that the body behave without leaving a trace. Handkerchiefs played a significant role in maintaining the image. These small pieces of fabric carried subtle perfumes, lavender, bergamot, or mild citrus, that were intended to drape over a man's presence without announcing themselves. Men learned to hold the handkerchief lightly near the mouth or chest during conversation, creating a gentle barrier. The gesture became habitual, a quiet shield against suspicion. For some, the handkerchief was not an accessory, but a necessary layer of protection. Distance also became part of the unspoken rules. Men were taught to maintain a certain space from others, not as a matter of etiquette, but as a precaution against revealing too much of themselves. Proximity risked discovery. In carriages, men angled their bodies away from passengers. In offices, they positioned chairs strategically so that no one sat too near. The arrangement of space conveyed order, and no one questioned why it felt so rigid. These behaviors reinforced the belief that scent reflected social status. Those who worked physically could not escape the reality of sweat, and society interpreted that sweat as a sign of inferiority. It was not the labor that diminished them, but the unavoidable evidence of effort. The ideal gentleman, in contrast, appeared untouched by exertion. His clothing remained crisp, his presence muted. The expectation created a gap between classes that could not be crossed by intention alone. Perfumers adapted their products to fit these standards. Fragrance for men became deliberately restrained, avoiding sweetness or bold notes. A gentleman's cologne was meant to hover just above perception, never strong enough to be remarked upon. The scent served to erase rather than express. Anything more noticeable risked being interpreted as vanity or, worse, an attempt to hide something unacceptable. The goal was always subtlety. In private, the maintenance of this ideal required constant effort. Men inspected their underlayers for signs of moisture, replaced garments quickly if they felt even slightly warm, and washed areas of the body selectively to avoid removing too much natural oil. They were careful not to scrub too aggressively, as irritated skin could betray them later. The process was meticulous, patient, and repetitive. Nothing was left to chance. The result was a version of masculinity that appeared detached from the physical world. A gentleman seemed to move through life without leaving marks, scents, or impressions. His presence was meant to be as controlled as his posture. It was a standard that required suppression of instinct, distance from others, and constant vigilance. The body was not celebrated, it was managed. Even conversations reflected this expectation. Men learned to keep their voices calm and their movements measured, as though sound and motion carried the same risk of exposure as scent. The ideal became a complete behavioral model, shaping demeanor as much as appearance. A gentleman was expected to be composed from the outside in, even if the process hollowed something essential. Over time, these standards became so deeply ingrained that few questioned them. Young men observing their elders adopted the same habits without understanding the fear that created them. What began as an attempt to avoid judgment transformed into a cultural norm that defined identity. Cleanliness was no longer about hygiene or even morality. It became a language of belonging. Everything in these expectations revealed how the image of refinement relied on suppressing the body rather than accepting it. A deeper strain soon emerged as men attempted to justify these rituals through medical or moral reasoning. Somewhere within those justifications, the distance between appearance and reality widened in ways that quietly reshaped daily life. Medical authorities of the Victorian era often spoke with an air of certainty that left little room for questioning, even when their claims rested on assumptions rather than evidence. In their writings, the human body was treated as something morally unstable, a vessel that required external guidance to remain pure. Books aimed at ordinary men advised the use of scented powders not only for physical comfort, but for preserving inner clarity, a phrase that blurred the line between hygiene and spiritual discipline. These texts presented fragrance as a tool for protecting the mind from impulses that were believed to rise from the body without warning. The logic behind these recommendations followed a simple path. Odor suggested disorder, and disorder suggested moral decline. Medical pamphlets warned that foul scents could stir unconscious desires, pushing the mind toward thoughts considered dangerous. Sweat was not merely moisture, it was a signal that temptation lurked just beneath the surface. Men who read these warnings absorbed them quietly, learning to view their own scent as the first hint of a threat that needed to be contained before it could shape their behavior. Physicians reinforced the connection by describing bodily odor as a form of communication between the physical and the psychological. According to some theories, a strong scent indicated that the mind lacked discipline, allowing instinct to seep into the world. The idea traveled through households, workplaces, and social circles until it became commonly accepted that fragrance served as a boundary between rational thought and something far less controlled. The belief persisted because it aligned with existing fears. The body acted unpredictably, while society demanded order. In this environment, powders and colognes took on the role of moral safeguards. Men applied them before leaving home, not for pleasure, but out of caution. A light layer of scent became a sign that one had taken responsibility for maintaining a proper state of mind. The act of powdering the body, shoulders, chest, and underarms became symbolic, a quiet ritual meant to reassure others that no impulse within the skin would intrude upon public life. Even the containers holding these powders were designed to look refined, emphasizing that the product served decorum rather than indulgence. These practices extended into daily movement. A man entering a public hall might pause to adjust his collar or check the scent beneath his coat. Not because anyone demanded it directly, but because failing to do so felt risky. Rooms filled with people created a space where scent circulated freely, and the possibility of being detected, of being interpreted, pressed heavily on him. The more crowded the environment, the more essential the protective layer of fragrance felt. Adherence to these recommendations created habits that shaped behavior in subtle ways. Men grew wary of standing too close to others, turning slightly away during conversation to ensure no one caught even the faintest trace of natural odor. They learned to manage their breath, their posture, and the distance between bodies. In this constant vigilance, the line between hygiene and morality blurred so completely that most no longer recognized the distinction. Scent became a measure of self-control, and failing to meet the standard was treated as a lapse in character rather than a simple physical reality. At home, the same expectations governed private routines. Men stored their powders in accessible places, applying them before meals, before visitors arrived, and sometimes even before bed. Fragrance drifted through bedrooms and parlors, leaving the impression that moral discipline required a continuous shield. Even without an audience, the fear of slipping into a state of perceived impurity weighed heavily. Some believed that neglecting these practices allowed chaotic thoughts to develop, a concern that kept them tied to their rituals long after the scent faded. These beliefs affected families as well. Parents taught sons that maintaining a controlled presence was essential to adulthood. The lessons began early. A boy who returned home with the smell of sweat from running or chores might be quietly reminded to compose himself, a phrase that implied more than physical tidiness. The child learned to associate his natural scent with the risk of being misunderstood, creating habits that would follow him into adulthood. What started as medical advice evolved into cultural instruction. Clergy and educators echoed the medical warnings, reinforcing the idea that bodily odor could disrupt moral stability. Sermons spoke of bodily discipline as a protection against temptation. Schools adopted similar sentiments, encouraging students to maintain a constant appearance of restraint. These messages layered over one another until the concept of purity became intertwined with the act of suppressing scent. What made these teachings effective was not their accuracy, but their alignment with the era's broader anxieties about desire and self-control. The Victorian world prized restraint, and anything that hinted at a lack of restraint was treated with suspicion. Odor, being unpredictable and difficult to fully eliminate, represented the threat of failing to meet expectations. Doctors did not need scientific proof to convince men to fear their own scent. They only needed to echo the fears already present in society. As the habit deepened, men found themselves relying on fragrance as a kind of armor. They carried scented handkerchiefs, folded precisely in pockets, ready to lift discreetly in a crowded space. They powdered their skin before important meetings, trusting the fine dust to signal composure. They avoided tasks that might cause sweat or hurried through them with hesitation. Even at moments of rest, the awareness of their bodies lingered, urging them to remain alert. This medical guidance, presented as practical advice, reshaped how men interacted with themselves and others. It justified the growing distance between individuals, making scent a quiet but powerful element of social judgment. In the process, men learned to view their bodies not as natural entities, but as potential faults waiting to be corrected through discipline and fragrance. Everything in these recommendations revealed how medicine reinforced fear rather than easing it. A stronger expectation soon emerged, pushing men to treat even minor traces of sweat as signs of instability. Within that growing tension, the body itself became a quiet source of uncertainty that shaped how they moved through every room. Victorian men lived with a steady unease toward their own skin, as though the act of touching it might reveal something they were not prepared to confront. The routines that filled their mornings and evenings reflected this discomfort in quiet, persistent ways. Many avoided examining their bodies closely, fearing that proximity would expose imperfections or scents that hinted at a lack of discipline. The body felt unpredictable, and unpredictability did not belong in a culture that valued restraint above all else. Distance became a form of safety. Bathing rituals offered some of the clearest signs of this hesitation. A man might stand before a basin with cold water poured into it, yet resist placing his hands directly on himself. Brushes with long handles, cloths folded thickly, and pumice stones were used to create layers between skin and sensation. The tools were not chosen for efficiency, but for separation. Touching the body meant acknowledging it, and acknowledging it meant confronting everything that society insisted must stay controlled. Even in private, the awareness of scent lingered. Before dressing, a man often hesitated at the thought of running his hands along his arms or torso. He feared discovering warmth or dampness that suggested his body acted freely without his permission. Such discoveries carried an emotional weight far beyond their physical reality. To him, they served as reminders that the body did not share his desire for composure. The instinctive response was to cover quickly, as though fabric could erase whatever the skin had just revealed. Dressing itself became an exercise in careful avoidance. Shirts were pulled on with brisk movements meant to limit contact. Gloves were sometimes worn while handling undergarments, particularly in colder months, when layers multiplied. Even the act of fastening buttons could feel like a negotiation with something unwelcome. Clothing formed a familiar shield. Structured, dull dry, controlled, while the body underneath felt like a quiet source of risk. This distance was not only physical, it shaped how men understood themselves emotionally. They were taught from childhood that the body needed management, not trust. Any sensation that drew attention, warmth, pressure, or the soft expansion of breath created a spark of discomfort. The body's responses were reminders of impulses society associated with weakness or moral decline. Men learned to flatten their awareness, to behave as though their physical existence were a shadow rather than a presence. In households where multiple generations lived together, this pattern grew even stronger. Fathers instructed their sons on the importance of restraint, demonstrating how to scrub with tools instead of hands and how to maintain distance without appearing neglectful. A boy watching these routines internalized the message early. Self-control meant resisting the instinct to touch, explore, or understand his own skin. By the time he reached adulthood, the habit felt natural. Medical advice reinforced the tendency. Posters and pamphlets warned that indulgence in bodily sensations, touch included, could weaken the mind. The warnings were rarely explicit, but their tone was unmistakable. A man should remain alert, disciplined, and detached. Touching the body without purpose risked awakening desires believed to lie dormant beneath the surface. A simple gesture like massaging a sore muscle could carry more meaning than comfort allowed, leading to a quiet sense of guilt that lingered long after clothing was replaced. Bathhouses offered no relief. The environment, filled with steam and echoes, amplified every sound and movement. Men remained visibly guarded, avoiding eye contact and keeping towels carefully positioned to limit exposure. Those who washed themselves did so with hurried precision, relying again on tools rather than hands. The experience rarely brought relaxation. Instead, it reinforced the notion that the body required supervision, not familiarity. In daily life, this caution extended to how men sat, walked, or rested. They avoided leaning too far back in chairs, as the shift in posture might reveal warmth between fabric and skin. They adjusted their clothing frequently, ensuring it did not cling. Even wiping the face on a warm day required a subtle gesture with a handkerchief rather than a hand, which would have created a moment of direct contact. The goal was always the same: control distance, reduce sensation, prevent awareness. Such habits created a quiet isolation. A man who could not comfortably engage with his own body struggled to feel at ease in the world around him. Intimacy, either emotional or physical, became fraught. The fear of being noticed, judged, or exposed lingered beneath simple interactions. What should have been natural, touching one's arm, adjusting one's clothing, recognizing one's own warmth, became acts tinged with unease. Silence formed around the topic, allowing the discomfort to persist across generations. The result was a culture where restraint masked vulnerability. Beneath polished manners and structured clothing lived an ongoing tension that shaped how men moved. I thought, and responded to themselves. Touch became less a means of knowing the body, and more a reminder that the body could not be fully controlled. This distance did not protect them, it merely hid the fear that guided their daily rituals. Everything in these behaviors showed how caution towards scent evolved into caution toward contact itself. A deeper form of restraint soon settled into their routines, shaping how they approached clothing, movement, and privacy. As this discipline tightened, the simple act of feeling alive became something they learned to push aside. Victorian men carried a quiet fear that followed them through every corner of their daily lives. A fear that had less to do with illness and more to do with the possibility of sensing something they believed should never be detected. The idea that a man might smell his own body became a source of unease strong enough to alter habits, routines, and relationships. Many learned to move through the world, hoping never to encounter the truth of their own scent. It was easier to prevent the moment entirely than to risk facing what it might imply about their character. Scented sachets became an unspoken companion. Small cloth pouches filled with herbs, powders, or perfumed grains were tucked into waistbands, coat pockets, or underlayers near the groin. They served a single purpose: create a barrier between the body and the world. Men adjusted them discreetly throughout the day, making sure the fragrance remained strong enough to mask anything that might escape from beneath layered clothing. The action itself grew so familiar that many performed it without thought, as though it were as natural as breathing. The anxiety reached far beyond practicality. Some men became convinced that their bodies emitted odors no one else could detect. These imagined scents, phantom impressions formed by stress and expectation, drove them to seek medical reassurance. Physicians recorded cases where the patient insisted that something inside him smelled wrong, even when no evidence supported the claim. The fear was not based on observation. It was based on the belief that scent revealed moral instability. Once the idea took hold, reason rarely dissolved it. Doctors, bound by the theories of their time, did little to ease such fears. Treatments ranged from herbal tonics to strict bathing routines, none of which addressed the deeper worry that lingered beneath the surface. The men who sought help often left with a sense of confirmation rather than relief. Their concerns were interpreted as symptoms of inner struggle, reinforcing the idea that vigilance was necessary. The mind became trapped in a cycle of scrutiny, searching constantly for signs of betrayal from the skin. This fear affected intimate life as well. A husband who once shared a bed comfortably might begin sleeping at its edge or turning his body away, creating physical space to protect his wife from a scent he believed harmful. In more extreme cases, some men chose to sleep in separate rooms or avoid shared bedding entirely. They convinced themselves that distance served as a form of care, even as it slowly eroded emotional closeness. The household adjusted around these habits in silence, rarely questioning what lay beneath them. Social life offered no refuge. In gatherings, a man worried not only about what others might perceive, but also what he might sense himself. He avoided leaning forward at dinner tables, refused to sit in warm corners of drawing rooms, and hesitated to bend or kneel where heat could rise beneath his clothing. Actions that required turning the body inward, tying boots, and adjusting stockings became moments of tension. The possibility of catching a trace of himself felt like opening a door best left closed. These behaviors seeped into posture and movement. Men held their torsos rigid, minimized bending, and took shallow breaths when alone in quiet spaces. A deep inhale risked revealing something they preferred not to acknowledge. Even the simple act of undressing became carefully managed. Clothing was removed quickly, often in cool rooms, to limit the chance of scent forming in the warm air near the skin. Laundered garments hung close by, ready to cover again as soon as washing ended. The impact of this anxiety was not loud or dramatic. It was steady. It shaped decisions, influenced comfort, and carved distance between the self and the body. The more a man feared detecting his own scent, the more he avoided any moment of closeness with his physical form. Hygiene turned into surveillance. Grooming became an attempt to erase. Nothing about these routines allowed familiarity or acceptance. Instead, they reinforced a belief that the body was unpredictable and required constant guarding. Even during sleep, the fear lingered. Bedsheets were scented heavily, pillows freshened with powders, and windows left open regardless of the weather. Evening rituals were repeated with quiet precision, washing specific areas, applying fragrances, checking fabric layers. The goal was not rest but prevention. Men fell asleep hoping they would not wake during the night and encounter a smell that suggested their efforts had failed. Over time, these habits created a deep disconnect. A man who could not safely acknowledge his own scent could hardly acknowledge other aspects of his physical existence. He lived at a deliberate distance from himself, guided by a belief that closeness was dangerous. That distance shaped his identity in ways he rarely examined. What he feared was not odor itself, but what odor represented in the moral framework of his world: loss of control, exposure of instinct, a glimpse of the self behind carefully crafted restraint. The fear of scent became a fear of contact, and the fear of contact became a fear of self. The boundary between body and identity grew rigid, reinforced by rituals that promised protection but delivered isolation. What began as caution became habit, and habit became belief. Everything in these quiet behaviors revealed how fear reshaped the most basic relationship a man had with his own skin. A stronger tension soon developed, as society encouraged even deeper layers of concealment in daily life. With each new expectation, the body's natural presence became something men tried desperately to keep at a distance. Bathing spaces of the era carried meanings far beyond cleanliness, turning ordinary washrooms into quiet chambers of moral discipline. A man approaching his basin or tub did not simply prepare to wash away dirt. He prepared to perform a ritual that affirmed his self-control. The simple act of pouring water into a container felt almost ceremonial, a gesture that connected physical maintenance with the preservation of inner order. In this world, the bathroom became one of the few places where he confronted the expectations of society without interruption. The idea that bathing cleansed more than the skin shaped how the routine unfolded. Men believed that washing the body reduced the influence of thoughts considered improper, as though cold water could quiet impulses that lived behind the ribs or beneath the surface of the mind. This belief encouraged a strict pattern: scrubbing with firm strokes, rinsing without lingering, drying briskly, and applying fragrance with deliberate restraint. Each movement served as evidence that discipline remained intact. Water was not only a solvent, it was a moral instrument. Morning rituals reflected this seriousness. A man standing before his washstand often moved with a solemn focus, repeating the same gestures every day, as though reciting something wordless. Brushes and cloths were arranged carefully, handled with the same precision one might use when arranging religious objects. The act of applying scented powders to the neck, chest, or underarms resembled a quiet prayer, an appeal for protection against impulses believed to rise from within. By the time he finished, he hoped to leave the room not simply clean, but purified. The design of personal bathtubs reinforced these ideas. Many tubs were deep, narrow, and enclosed, creating a sense of isolation that encouraged introspection rather than comfort. Some households placed these tubs in rooms with minimal decoration, where cold walls and dim light amplified the impression of seriousness. The space felt less like a place to relax and more like a chamber intended for correction. A man stepping into such a tub entered a moment of solitude meant to affirm discipline rather than ease tension. Bathing also carried expectations about posture and behavior. Men were encouraged to remain upright, composed, and quiet, even when alone. Lounging or soaking for pleasure was discouraged, as it implied indulgence rather than restraint. The water was often kept cool, believed to strengthen willpower and suppress disruptive emotions. When warmth was used, it was done sparingly, as though comfort itself might weaken moral resolve. In this environment, the bathtub became a tool that shaped identity rather than a refuge from daily life. The washroom served as a boundary between the inner and outer worlds. Before stepping into public spaces, a man entered this private chamber to ensure he carried no scent that could betray him. He checked his clothing, adjusted layers, and reapplied fragrance with a kind of nervous precision. The goal was to present a composed exterior that revealed nothing of the body underneath. Every departure from the washroom felt like crossing a threshold, moving from a controlled environment into one where judgment lurked in every interaction. In wealthier homes, the washroom's symbolic role grew even stronger. Elaborate basins, polished fixtures, and decorative containers masked the anxiety that shaped their use. Servants prepared water and supplies according to routines that mirrored their employers' expectations. The quiet efficiency of these preparations underscored the gravity of the ritual. Cleanliness was not a preference. It was a requirement tied to reputation. A well-maintained washroom signaled that the household upheld moral standards, even if the reality behind the scenes was far more complex. For men of lower income, the symbolism remained, even when the facilities were limited. Shared washrooms in boarding houses or communal spaces required careful timing to avoid unwanted proximity. Men arrived early or late, carrying their own small bags of powders and scented cloths. They completed their routines quickly, aware that lingering might invite scrutiny. Despite the modest setting, the same unspoken expectation held steady. Bathing meant demonstrating control over oneself. These rituals shaped how men thought about the relationship between water and morality. Many came to believe that failing to wash properly left them vulnerable not only to odor but to inner disorder. Diaries and letters from the period described discomfort on days when washing was impossible, emphasizing a sense of unease that went beyond physical inconvenience. To skip the ritual meant carrying a burden of uncertainty, as though a protective layer had been removed. Even the architecture of homes catered to this mindset. Some houses included small, enclosed washrooms separate from bedrooms, emphasizing the idea that personal purification required its own space. These rooms resembled narrow cells, offering privacy but little comfort. The emptiness of the space reinforced the seriousness of the task. A man entered to correct himself, not to enjoy his body or surroundings. The social meaning of these practices extended into public perception. A man known for maintaining rigid bathing habits earned quiet approval, while those who appeared lax faced suspicion. Cleanliness functioned as a code that signaled restraint. Neglecting bathing rituals risked being interpreted as neglecting moral boundaries as well. The more thoroughly a man performed these tasks, the more securely he fit into the ideal of respectability. Over time, the washroom transformed from a practical necessity into a symbolic environment. The objects inside, un bassin, cloths, powders, soaps, stood for more than hygiene. They represented a system of belief that placed the highest value on concealment, control, and the quiet suppression of human instinct. What happened in these confined spaces shaped how men behaved once they stepped outside them. Everything in these rituals showed how the washroom became a stage where men practiced the discipline demanded of them. A heavier burden soon emerged as the pressure to appear controlled expanded into other corners of daily life. Each passing year made the body's natural rhythms more difficult to express in a world determined to restrain them. When fragrance companies realized how deeply men feared their own bodies, advertising shifted to exploit that fear with remarkable precision. Perfume was no longer presented as a luxury or a pleasant accessory. It was reframed as a necessary safeguard against impulses believed to linger beneath the skin. The language used in posters, pamphlets, and shop displays treated fragrance as a protective barrier, something that shielded the wearer from instincts society considered dangerous. Men did not buy perfume for enjoyment, they bought it for reassurance. Manufacturers crafted their messages carefully. They described certain scents as capable of suppressing inner chaos, promising that a few drops could restore composure. Words like purity, discipline, and self-command appeared frequently, suggesting that fragrance served as a kind of moral reinforcement. The idea resonated strongly with men who already feared that their bodies might reveal more than they wanted. A bottle of cologne became a tool to maintain order, a silent companion meant to hide whatever their bodies threatened to expose. Eau de cologne quickly became the centerpiece of this movement. It was advertised not as a simple scented mixture, but as a symbol of refinement. The man who used it was portrayed as rational, controlled, and elevated above the unpredictable nature of physical existence. Illustrations often depicted gentlemen in immaculate clothing, standing apart from the crowd with perfect composure. The message was unmistakable. Fragrance was proof of mastery. To omit it suggested carelessness, or worse, vulnerability. Scents themselves were chosen with intention. Notes of wood, mint, and musk were emphasized because advertisers claimed they provided stability. Wood represented steadiness, mint represented clarity, and musk, altered to seem refined rather than earthy, represented controlled strength. These associations had little basis in chemistry, yet they carried emotional power. Men believed that choosing the right scent reinforced their identity, allowing them to present a version of themselves that appeared secure and contained. Stores adapted to this shift in expectation. Fragrance counters displayed bottles in orderly rows, each design hinting at discipline rather than indulgence. Dark glass, sharp edges, and minimal decoration replaced ornate embellishments. The aesthetic suggested seriousness, aligning with the belief that fragrance existed to manage the body's flaws. Even the act of purchasing cologne required a steady posture. Men often approached these counters quietly, as though admitting to a private concern. Advertising also targeted younger men, encouraging them to adopt fragrance early. Manuals on grooming advised that a gentleman should carry a subtle scent at all times. Pamphlets warned that neglecting fragrance left one exposed to suspicion, especially in formal settings. A young man hoping to enter respectable society learned quickly that applying cologne was not optional. It was a silent signal that he understood the rules and accepted the expectations placed upon him. This pressure extended into households. Bottles of cologne were kept near washstands, ready to be used at the start and end of the day. Some men applied fragrance not only to the skin but also lightly to clothing, believing it strengthened the protective effect. Handkerchiefs were scented deliberately, folded, and stored in ways that preserved the aroma. These gestures became part of a man's daily routine, repeated with a calm seriousness that revealed how deeply the ideas had settled into ordinary life. In workplaces, cologne created invisible boundaries. A man who used fragrance properly was considered dependable, capable of restraining instinct. Those who avoided it risked being associated with disorder, regardless of their behavior. The scent in the air often determined how colleagues interpreted a person's character. Even a conversation could be shaped by the presence or absence of fragrance, turning ordinary interactions into subtle tests of conformity. As demand grew, companies expanded their product lines. They introduced variations with slightly different notes, each marketed as suitable for a specific personality type. Yet the underlying message remained the same: without fragrance, the body could betray the man who carried it. Advertisements repeated this implication so consistently that it became truth in the public imagination. Fragrance transformed from accessory to necessity, from refinement to armor. These beliefs affected not only public behavior, but private relationships as well. Men sometimes applied cologne before speaking with their wives, or before entering shared rooms. They feared that any natural scent might suggest indiscipline or emotional instability. Some avoided physical closeness unless they had recently refreshed their fragrance. Domestic warmth became layered with caution, shaped by the silent expectation that the body remained dangerous unless managed through scent. What made this transformation striking was how seamlessly it blended with pre-existing anxieties. Men already distrusted their bodies. Fragrance merely offered a socially approved way to hide that distrust. It provided a thin shield against judgment, even though it deepened the distance between a man and his physical self. The more heavily society leaned on fragrance as a moral tool, the more intensely men felt compelled to use it. By the height of these trends, fragrance was no longer associated with pleasure at all. It carried the weight of obligation. Men purchased it faithfully, stored it carefully, and applied it with a kind of quiet desperation. The scent they carried into the world was meant to replace something natural that had been deemed unacceptable. Everything in these advertisements showed how fragrance became a symbol of control rather than expression. A quieter shift soon developed, as men began relying on these scents not to enhance themselves, but to silence what they feared inside. New layers of expectation gradually tightened around them, reinforcing the idea that the body could not be trusted without intervention. Men carried an unspoken expectation whenever they stepped into the presence of women, an expectation that shaped how they prepared themselves long before any interaction occurred. The body had to be softened, disguised, and corrected so it would not reveal anything considered improper. A man approaching a social gathering often paused at the doorway, adjusting his clothing and checking the faint scent on his handkerchief, aware that even a trace of natural odor might suggest he lacked restraint. In conversations about etiquette, writers repeatedly emphasized that a gentleman's fragrance was not an ornament. It was a declaration of self-control. The belief that unpleasant scent offended women carried immense weight. It reinforced the idea that men's bodies held something disruptive, something capable of disturbing the emotional equilibrium of a room. Women were described as delicate and morally sensitive, supposedly able to detect disorder through scent alone. This assumption pressured men to maintain a carefully curated presence whenever they entered female company. The obligation clung to them like a quiet shadow, shaping their behavior more than they realized. Handkerchiefs scented with cologne became essential tools. Men carried them not only to dab at sweat, but to create distance between their bodies and the women they greeted. When touching a woman's hand, even briefly, a man often ensured that the cloth concealed his palm. The gesture seemed refined on the surface, but beneath it lay a deeper unease. The fear that skin-to-skin contact might expose something uncontrolled. The handkerchief softened that risk, offering a small barrier that allowed the interaction to proceed without incident. Social encounters magnified these anxieties. Rooms filled with conversation and movement became silent tests of whether a man could preserve the image expected of him. Balls, dinners, and public halls required vigilance. He had to manage posture, gestures, and breathing while ensuring that no sign of physical exertion appeared. A faint scent of perspiration could erode what others thought of him. It was not merely about comfort, it was about moral interpretation. Men lived in awareness that scent carried meaning far beyond the body. Courtship deepened the pressure. When speaking with a woman privately, even for a few minutes, a man often rehearses how far to stand and how long to remain. Too close, and he risked revealing something intimate. Too distant, and he seemed cold or untrustworthy. The balance was delicate, shaped by rules spoken and unspoken. A man relied heavily on fragrance to stabilize this tension. Scent became the invisible shield he depended on to maintain composure. Homes reflected these expectations as well. Many men applied fragrance before entering shared spaces, especially parlors where female relatives or visitors might be present. They believed that a composed scent reassured women, signaling that the household was orderly. Diaries describe men stepping aside to refresh their handkerchiefs before sitting at the table, worried that the day's labor or stress might linger faintly on their clothing. Even in private spaces, the need to appear controlled persisted. Public transportation and crowded streets intensified these fears. Men avoided raising their arms or leaning too close to fellow passengers, anxious that warmth or movement might release a scent they could not contain. Handkerchiefs remained within reach, used to mask the face or neck when pressing through busy areas. The need for constant self-monitoring drained them quietly, yet it became such a normal part of life that few questioned it. Advertisements took advantage of this cultural tension. Companies promoted specific scents as safe for social gatherings, claiming they projected reliability and emotional steadiness. Men were told that the right fragrance prevented misunderstandings, strengthened reputations, and protected women from discomfort. The message suggested that failure to use fragrance reflected a failure of character. This belief spread quickly, becoming woven into expectations that governed everything from courtship to business. Magazines reinforced the pressure by praising men who appeared refreshing or discreetly fragrant. These descriptions created standards that were difficult to maintain. A man's worth became linked to how little of his natural body he revealed. Clean scent symbolized trustworthiness. Natural odor symbolized disorder. The distinction left little room for authenticity. Men performed their roles carefully, aware that a single misstep could shift how others viewed them. Some men internalized the expectations so deeply that they felt uneasy in moments of intimacy. The fear of being judged for scent overshadowed the experience itself. They controlled their breathing, adjusted their posture, and checked their clothing even when no one else noticed. What should have been warmth between two people often became another test of restraint. The space between bodies grew heavy with expectation rather than connection. In these encounters, the scent did not simply indicate hygiene. It indicated whether a man understood his place in society, whether he could mold himself to meet the standards imposed upon him. The pressure shaped not only how he appeared, but how he thought about himself. He carried the belief that his natural body threatened others, that concealment was a kindness. The result was a quiet distance that settled into every interaction, even those meant to be tender. By the time these expectations reached their height, men rarely questioned them. They prepared themselves for the presence of women with the same seriousness they brought to public duties. Fragrance became a requirement, not an option, because scent itself served as a measure of character. The more carefully he controlled it, the more confidently he moved through the world. Everything in these expectations revealed how social pressure shaped not just presentation but emotion. A muted strain soon developed as men began to fear not only what women might sense, but what their own bodies might betray. In that tension, the desire for connection slowly twisted into something guarded and restrained. Reputation in this era balanced on details so small that even scent could alter the course of a man's life. Whispered rumors about odor spread through workplaces, clubs, and drawing rooms with a quiet efficiency that made them nearly impossible to escape. A single complaint, spoken lightly or carelessly, could stain a man's standing in ways that no explanation could undo. People listened closely to such stories because scent was believed to reveal truths about a person's discipline and character. Once a rumor took hold, it often hardened into judgment long before the man himself heard of it. Incidents of lost positions circulated in newspapers and diaries. A clerk dismissed from his office, a teacher removed from his post, or a shopkeeper avoided by customers, all due to hints that something was not quite right about his presence. Rarely did these accounts specify details. The absence of precision made them even more dangerous. The idea alone was enough. Those in authority acted quickly, believing they protected the integrity of their institutions. A man marked by these suspicions had little recourse. Silence from his colleagues confirmed his fears, and the lack of confrontation meant the accusation lingered indefinitely. Households developed their own systems to prevent such disasters. Wealthier men hired servants whose duties included quietly monitoring scent, stepping close enough at regular intervals to determine whether intervention was needed. These attendants carried scented cloths, powders, and solutions, prepared to address concerns without drawing attention. The arrangement offered reassurance, but it also deepened anxiety. A man never knew precisely when he might be judged, and the reliance on another person's assessment made him vulnerable in ways he rarely acknowledged aloud. Daily routines adjusted to accommodate these fears. Men stored fragrance bottles in their coat pockets or desk drawers, applying them discreetly throughout the day. They brushed their clothing not simply to remove dust, but to check whether scent lingered on the fabric. Many kept extra shirts nearby, changing if they suspected that any part of their body had reacted to heat, stress, or exertion. Even in winter, when the air was cold and still, the fear persisted. It was not about comfort, it was about being interpreted correctly. Workplaces institutionalized these expectations. Offices and factories adopted informal codes that demanded restraint and cleanliness beyond practical necessity. Supervisors observed employees with quiet scrutiny, noting signs of fatigue or perspiration as indicators of deeper flaws. Rumors spread quickly, carried across lunch tables and hallways by people who believed they protected their environment. A man could sense when he had become the subject of such attention, even if no one spoke to him directly. The sudden distance in greetings, the glances, the hesitations, all signaled that something had shifted. Public venues added further layers of pressure. Clubs and social societies prided themselves on refinement, and members monitored one another with vigilance. A man entering these spaces felt the weight of unspoken rules settle around him. He moved carefully, aware that missteps could place him at the center of conversation long after he left the room. In these settings, fragrance became a form of armor. Without it, he risked seeming careless or unfit for participation in respectable life. The fear of social decline encouraged men to adopt preventive measures that bordered on ritualistic. Before important meetings, they stood near windows or doorways to ensure fresh air circulated them. They avoided crowded staircases, aware that proximity increased risk. Some limited their diets, believing certain foods produced scents that could betray them. In extreme cases, men chose positions in rooms based on airflow, using subtle drafts to redirect whatever they feared might escape. At home, these concerns shaped relationships between master and servant. A man often relied on his household staff to maintain his public image, trusting them to prepare clothing, manage laundering, and keep scented items in supply. Any lapse could lead to worries that extended far beyond personal discomfort. Servants understood the stakes and performed their duties with care, knowing that the household's stability rested in part on their attention to these details. The deeper consequence of these expectations was the erosion of personal ease. Men lived in constant awareness that their bodies were under evaluation. Even moments of solitude carried pressure, because scent lingered whether others were present or not. The body became a quiet adversary, capable of undermining status without warning. To counter this threat, men layered themselves in powders, collants, and behavioral codes designed to minimize risk. Despite the severity of these concerns, few questioned the logic behind them. The belief that odor indicated moral weakness had taken root so thoroughly that avoiding social judgment seemed more reasonable than examining the assumption itself. In this environment, protecting one's standing required constant vigilance, and fragrance served as a promise that the man remained disciplined, orderly, and worthy of trust. By the height of these anxieties, the connection between scent and societal worth had grown so strong that men treated fragrance as a form of reputation insurance. They carried it with them, relied on it, and feared what might happen without it. Social life became a careful performance, each movement shaped by the hope that nothing unintended would drift into the air. Everything in these fears revealed how status depended not on ability, but on how successfully a man concealed the body he lived in. A quieter unease soon formed as households expanded these routines into constant surveillance. Through that vigilance, private life began to resemble a silent campaign to correct what nature produced without permission. A single unpleasant scent carried enough weight to reshape a man's entire standing, not because of its physical presence, but because of what people believed it revealed. In this world, odor functioned as a form of silent testimony, suggesting weakness where words claimed discipline. A man walking into a room could feel eyes measuring him, not for his achievements or his manner, but for signs of something less tangible. Those around him watched for stillness, composure, and the faintest hint of a fragrance meant to signal control. Any deviation invited suspicion. In conversations among colleagues, scent appeared as a topic only in quiet moments, exchanged in half-whispered remarks that travelled farther than their speakers intended. A comment such as, "He seemed unprepared today," often carried a deeper implication, hinting that something physical had slipped beyond expected boundaries. Such remarks moved through offices, clubs, and gatherings with surprising speed, acquiring new layers as they travelled. By the time they reached the subject, the original meaning had blurred into something heavier, something that questioned his character. Those who experienced this form of judgment often recognized it too late. A shift in how others greeted them, a pause before handshakes, or an unexpected formality from long-time acquaintances signaled that something had changed. These adjustments were subtle but unmistakable. The man affected sensed a distance forming around him, built not from overt hostility, but from the soft withdrawal of comfort. He often responded with increased caution, refreshing fragrance more often, checking clothing for traces of sweat, moving carefully through shared spaces, hoping to repair something he did not fully understand. Households were not immune to these pressures. Men from well-regarded families believed their reputations extended beyond their homes, carried into the world by the scent they projected. Many spoke gently to servants, requesting updates on laundering or the condition of certain garments. These interactions carried an uncomfortable mixture of dependency and fear. Servants understood their roles clearly. They were expected to notice shifts in scent before others did, offering quiet corrections that protected the household's name. Their silence became part of the family's defense. In environments where authority mattered, scent became a precarious threshold. Supervisors, teachers, civil officers, and shopkeepers often maintained their positions through the perception of orderliness. Any suggestion that they failed to control their bodies threatened the trust others placed in them. Even in the absence of formal accusations, a man could sense when confidence in him weakened. He felt it in the slower requests for guidance, the cautious tone of conversations, and the unspoken expectation that he should correct something unaddressed. The fear of losing status influenced everyday decisions. Men walked more slowly to avoid perspiration, avoided certain rooms known for poor ventilation, and stood near open windows when possible. They declined invitations to crowded gatherings or heated events, worried that the strain might alter their scent. Social obligations, once straightforward, became calculations weighed against risk. The decision to attend a dinner or a meeting often depended on whether a man believed he could maintain perfect composure. What intensified these pressures was the belief that scent revealed not just physical condition but moral standing. People assumed that a man who carried an unpleasant odor lacked discipline, self-control, or purity of thought. Advertisements, etiquette guide, and household manuals reinforced these associations repeatedly, teaching that failure to manage the body indicated failure in character. This belief seeped into how men viewed themselves, turning scent into a measure of worth. The consequences extended into family life. A man who sensed judgment from colleagues or neighbors sometimes withdrew into silence at home. He feared that those closest to him might detect what others claimed to notice. Even small gestures, such as stepping aside when a family member approached, revealed a deeper anxiety, the belief that his body could betray him without warning. The home, once a space of comfort, became another arena where he managed himself carefully. Rumors about scent rarely allowed for redemption. Once a man's reputation faltered, he found it difficult to correct. People remembered the accusation even after evidence faded, repeating it in moments of casual conversation. Each repetition reinforced the belief that something had been exposed. The man might adopt strict routines, refresh his clothing constantly, and move with cautious precision. Yet the original rumor clung to him. In this environment, scent became a permanent threat, a silent force capable of undoing years of effort. The quiet tragedy of these expectations was the isolation they created. Men learned to fear natural expression, treating their own bodies as unpredictable adversaries. Even moments of stillness carried weight because the absence of movement did not eliminate the risk of judgment. In every setting, a man navigated the space between how he felt and how he appeared, aware that others might translate the slightest scent into a story about who he truly was. By the height of these anxieties, reputation felt fragile enough to fracture under the pressure of something as small as a shift in the air. Men guarded themselves through fragrance, posture, and practiced restraint, trying to avoid the possibility of exposure. Status depended not on confidence, but on concealment, an identity built from the suppression of ordinary human experience. Everything in these expectations revealed how scent transformed into a symbol of vulnerability rather than humanity. A heavier strain soon settled over daily life, as men realized that managing their presence required constant vigilance. Through that vigilance, the simple act of moving through a room became a test they never stopped taking. Some men began to sense odors that no one else detected, faint impressions that clung to their thoughts more tightly than any physical trace. These imagined scents drifted into their awareness at unpredictable moments, during quiet evenings, in crowded rooms, or in the stillness before sleep. The absence of confirmation from others did not ease their fears. Instead, the uncertainty deepened them. They wondered whether something inside their bodies had shifted, releasing signals they alone could perceive. The more they focused on the possibility, the more convincing the sensation became. Doctors of the time encountered these cases with a mixture of caution and fascination. They listened to men describe invisible odors with steady voices, noting how each detail seemed rooted in genuine distress. Some physicians offered explanations that blurred science and speculation, suggesting that the mind sometimes produced scents as warnings of emotional imbalance. Others turned to practical remedies, prescribing scented powders, soaps, and colognes intended to reassure the patient. These solutions rarely addressed the underlying anxiety, but they offered structure, something the men could hold on to. For some, the imagined scent followed them everywhere. During meals, the sensation drifted across their thoughts like a quiet interruption. In conversation, it appeared suddenly, disrupting their ability to focus. These men checked their clothing repeatedly, washed their hands even when clean, and shaped their routines around the desire for certainty. When no one around them reacted, the divide between their internal experience and the world outside grew sharper. They struggled to trust their own senses, unsure whether the body was betraying them or whether the mind had created its own phantom. Nighttime magnified the problem. The silence of a bedroom left room for the imagined scent to grow louder in their thoughts. Some lay awake for hours, waiting for the sensation to fade. only to find it growing stronger. The lack of sleep deepened their unease, blurring the line between reality and imagination. Letters from the period describe men pacing across floorboards in the early hours, opening windows in the cold, or pressing handkerchiefs to their faces in an attempt to regain control. The darkness made the body feel larger, its presence more difficult to ignore. Family members often misunderstood these struggles. They offered reassurance, reminding the men that no unpleasant odor was present. But reassurance rarely settled the fear. The men who experienced these imagined scents felt certain that something lay beneath the surface, something too faint for others to detect, yet too persistent to dismiss. Their attempts to articulate this unease frequently produced awkward silences. Loved ones listened with concern, but without shared perception. They could not bridge the gap. Doctors introduced psychological interpretations as the cases multiplied. They claimed that the imagined scent reflected stress, moral pressure, or emotional strain. Some treatments encouraged rest. Others recommended distraction or gentle conversation. Scented oils were applied not to mask anything physical, but to redirect attention. The goal was not the elimination of odor, but the realignment of thought. Yet many patients found these explanations unsettling. The idea that the mind could produce a sensation so convincing threatened their trust in themselves. The social environment worsened the condition. Men already feared judgment from colleagues and acquaintances. The possibility that they carried an odor no one else noticed created a strange tension. Relief that others could not detect it, mixed with fear that they themselves might eventually reveal it. They rehearsed how to move, how to speak, and how to breathe around others, hoping to minimize any chance of exposure. In this state, imagined scents became another form of vigilance, a symptom of the constant monitoring they performed on their bodies. Some turned inward, limiting their interactions to reduce anxiety. They avoided gatherings, declined invitations, and spent long hours alone. Isolation offered temporary relief, but reinforced the belief that something was wrong. The home became a quiet echo chamber where the imagined scent grew more pronounced. Even familiar rooms felt different, carrying the suggestion that the problem followed them everywhere. In this solitude, the body's presence pressed against their thoughts with a weight that felt inescapable. The condition emerged not from vanity, but from the relentless expectations surrounding scent and morality. Men had been taught for years that odor indicated weakness. That message seeped into their perceptions so deeply that even the absence of scent could feel suspicious. Their bodies became sources of uncertainty, capable of producing signals that undermined their sense of control. The imagined scent represented the end of a cultural fixation, a world where the fear of judgment grew stronger than the body's own reality. Doctors documented these cases carefully, but rarely challenged the beliefs that caused them. They treated symptoms without questioning the system that produced them. As a result, the condition persisted quietly, moving through households and workplaces without drawing widespread attention. It became one more consequence of a society that placed extraordinary pressure on men to silence every trace of their physical selves. Everything in these struggles revealed how fear could create sensations as powerful as anything the body produced. A deeper vulnerability soon surfaced as men found themselves responding to anxieties no one else could observe. In that fragile space, self-perception became a shifting landscape shaped more by expectation than experience. The marketplace responded quickly to the rising fear surrounding men's bodies, shaping those anxieties into an industry that grew with remarkable force. Soap, perfumi, powders, and cleansing solutions were no longer simple commodities. They became moral tools, objects that promised protection from impulses believed to lie beneath ordinary skin. Shops displayed them with a seriousness that suggested duty rather than indulgence. Men browsing these shelves felt not temptation, but obligation, as though each item participated in a quiet campaign to maintain order. Companies recognized the opportunity and crafted messages that blended hygiene with righteousness. Advertisements framed their products as safeguards against internal weakness. The language was familiar: purity, restraint, discipline. A bar of soap was described as a guardian, standing between the user and the unruly parts of himself. Bottles of fragrance claimed the power to correct moods, strengthen, resolve, and silence desires. Manufacturers leaned heavily on these ideas, not because they reflected scientific reality, but because they resonated deeply with men conditioned to distrust their own bodies. Wedding culture absorbed this thinking with ease. Gift tables began to display hand-washing solutions, scented powders, and grooming kits arranged with delicate ribbons. These items symbolized preparation for adult life, not merely marriage, but entry into a world where physical discipline defined character. Guests viewed such gifts not as practical supplies, but as contributions to a couple's moral foundation. The implication was clear: a household that cared about hygiene would care about virtue as well. Even young grooms felt the pressure, sensing that their roles required the constant suppression of anything natural. Instructional manuals expanded alongside these trends. Books marketed as guides for male refinement sold rapidly, filled with statements that fused moral order with bodily control. They urged men to wash with determination, apply fragrance strategically, and monitor themselves throughout the day. These texts read like sermons disguised as advice, offering reassurance that failure in grooming signaled failure in spirit. Many men kept such manuals beside their mirrors, rereading sections in the morning light as though rehearsing the expectations placed upon them. Shops specialized in moral hygiene products appeared in busy districts. Their windows displayed rows of soaps molded into sharp, geometric shapes, emphasizing clarity and precision. The interior layout often felt austere, designed to evoke the seriousness of a medical office rather than the warmth of a general store. Customers walked through slowly, aware that their purchases communicated something about their self-discipline. Even clerks assumed roles shaped by these standards, recommending certain scents with the practiced tone of advisors guiding moral choices. Households adapted in small but telling ways. New containers appeared on washstands, labeled with words such as purity, refinement, and composure. Families stored scented powders in decorative tins that blended seamlessly with furniture, subtly reinforcing the idea that control of the body was part of maintaining the home itself. Children grew up watching fathers complete cleansing routines with the careful repetition of a ritual. These routines became performances that shaped identity as much as daily grooming. Laboratories and factories adjusted their production methods to match the rising demand. Workers handled vast quantities of oils, powders, and pigments intended to support the illusion of moral clarity. In pamphlets distributed to retailers, companies claimed that their formulas strengthened virtue by protecting men from the impurities of the world. The language blurred scientific advancement with spiritual correction, creating a hybrid narrative that appealed to consumers who already feared their own nature. Public spaces reflected these shifts. Posters showed silhouettes of men walking upright, accompanied by slogans promising confidence, control, and calm. The fragrances advertised were meant not to attract attention, but to erase it, to replace uncertainty with a sense of quiet authority. These posters appeared in train stations, factories, and reading rooms, reminding men that their presence required careful shaping. The images rarely depicted bodies in motion. They emphasized stillness, composure, and polished surfaces. Instruction extended beyond grooming. Some manuals suggested specific ways to stand, breathe, and gesture to minimize the risk of unwanted scent. Men learned to open doors with measured movements, sit in ways that avoided heat buildup, and adjust layers of clothing to create airflow. These behaviors became part of the industry's reach, subtle reminders that the body must not be allowed to express itself too freely. Even the act of buying soap transformed into a commitment to self-surveillance. The rise of this industry revealed how deeply fear shaped consumption. Men purchased items not because they brought comfort, but because they seemed necessary for survival in a culture that scrutinized every trace of scent. Companies capitalized on that scrutiny, offering solutions to problems they quietly reinforced. Over time, the connection between product and virtue grew so tight that refusing to participate felt dangerous, as though stepping outside the system meant exposing oneself to judgment. By the height of these developments, the notion of moral hygiene had become woven into everyday life. The industry succeeded because it mirrored values that already existed. Values built on anxiety, restraint, and the belief that the body posed a constant threat. What men bought did more than cleanse them. It shaped how they understood themselves and how the world interpreted their silence, their movements, and their presence. Everything in this expanding industry revealed how commerce transformed fear into habit. A slower unease soon emerged as these routines began to dictate not just behavior but identity. Through these expectations, men learned to measure themselves against standards that narrowed with every passing year. Men gradually learned to move through life as though their own bodies were unpredictable forces that required constant restraint. Sensations that should have been ordinary, warmth on the skin, a trace of sweat after exertion, the natural rise and fall of breath, became signs they monitored with quiet vigilance. Each reaction of the body felt like a potential breach, a reminder that something uncontrolled might reveal itself at the wrong moment. Instead of trusting their physical instincts, they treated those instincts as warnings. The body's signals no longer guided them, they unsettled them. This distrust took root early. Boys, observing the routines of their fathers, absorbed the message that bodily expression belonged to a private world, unacceptable beyond closed doors. They noticed how men stiffened their posture in public, how they kept their hands still, how they avoided wiping their brows even in discomfort. The effort to contain the body became part of learning adulthood. By the time these boys grew older, they had mastered the practice of concealing discomfort, believing that maturity required suppressing anything that hinted at vulnerability. Sweat created the deepest anxiety. A man feeling moisture beneath his clothing did not experience it as a natural response, but as a threat to his dignity. He adjusted his posture subtly, limited his movements, and remained aware of nearby air currents that might betray him. Heat in crowded rooms intensified the tension. Men stood near windows or along walls, hoping the cooler surfaces would keep their bodies quiet. Even breathing patterns changed. Shallow breaths reduced warmth, while stillness minimized the risk of scent escaping. The same fear applied to scent. Even when none existed, men leaned away from others during conversations, placing just enough distance to feel protected. They tightened their clothing in ways meant to trap warmth, then loosened it moments later when the sensation felt dangerous. Their behavior reflected a constant negotiation with themselves, a silent argument between what the body felt and what the mind insisted it must suppress. They lived in a state of steady alertness, waiting for signs that their physical presence might overstep the boundaries society set. At home, the struggle continued. Men touched their clothing hesitantly after removing it, checking for moisture or faint traces of odor. They washed not with comfort in mind, but with determination, scrubbing until the skin reddened in hopes of removing whatever might cast doubt on their composure. The washstand became a place of evaluation rather than relief. Towels, bassins, and powders were tools in a battle they believed they had to fight daily. Beneath their careful routines lay a persistent fear that the body might betray them despite their efforts. Even moments meant for rest became fraught. Sitting alone in a quiet room, a man sometimes noticed the warmth in his hands or the tension in his shoulders and treated these sensations as problems to correct. Natural impulses, stretching, relaxing, and sighing felt dangerous because they acknowledged physical presence too openly. The expectation of restraint had woven itself so deeply into thought that the absence of movement became the safest expression. Stillness served as a way to avoid confronting the body's needs. In social settings, the internal struggle intensified. A man walking into a room measured the speed of his steps. Aware that exertion might raise his temperature, he avoided laughing too freely, concerned that a sudden shift in breath might draw attention. Even small gestures, reaching for a glass, leaning toward a conversation, were performed with practiced control. The fear of losing command over the body overshadowed the interactions themselves, turning simple gatherings into quiet tests of discipline. Clothing, intended to provide comfort or protection, became another layer of surveillance. Men wore structured garments that restricted movement, believing that containment supported virtue. Stiff collars, heavy fabrics, and multiple layers served as barriers between the self and the world. While the garments hid signs of ordinary bodily function, they also reminded the wearer of constant constraint. Every tug, pinch, or pressure reinforced the idea that the body belonged under control, not expression. Relationships suffered under this silent tension. Some men hesitated to let loved ones sit too closely, worried that proximity might reveal a warmth or scent they had not yet corrected. They spoke softly, offering minimal movement as though stillness could shield them. Physical affection took on a measured quality. Stripped of spontaneity, the body felt untrustworthy even in tenderness, and the fear of judgment seeped into moments that should have offered relief from the outside world. The deeper tragedy was the way men internalized these beliefs. They came to see the body not as part of themselves, but as a flawed companion requiring constant oversight. Self-worth became tied to control, and any deviation felt like personal failure. Over time, the endless monitoring shaped how they understood identity. They valued composure over comfort, restraint over ease, and silence over expression. The body's smallest reactions became reminders of a battle they feared they could never fully win. By the height of these anxieties, men had learned to interpret natural sensations as warnings rather than signals of life. The body existed in the background, watched carefully but rarely trusted. In this world, discipline defined dignity, and the effort to maintain that discipline consumed more energy than most dared admit. Everything in this struggle revealed how easily the body became something to fear rather than inhabit. A heavier weight soon settled over daily life, as men tried to outrun sensations that rose uninvited from within. Under that pressure, the boundary between self and flesh slowly thinned into a fragile, uneasy truce. Bathing became one of the clearest expressions of how men attempted to discipline their bodies. A daily ritual shaped more by fear than by comfort. The basin or tub, whether simple or elaborate, functioned as a quiet stage where a man confronted what he believed needed correction. Cold water, favored for its harshness, was used not because it soothed the body, but because it promised to restrain it. Men stepped into the chill with controlled breaths, willing themselves to endure the shock as though the discomfort would train their minds to remain steady under pressure. The water's bite became a measure of resolve. Guides from the period described cold bathing as a method for cleansing the mind as much as the flesh. They encouraged men to imagine that the water swept through the mind, clearing away impulses that threatened self-control. This association transformed the bath into a kind of private discipline, performed in silence with a seriousness that resembled prayer. Even in the privacy of the washroom, men held themselves upright and withdrew from anything that resembled relaxation. To enjoy the water was to risk indulgence. To endure it was to affirm dignity. Brushing routines reflected a similar intensity. Men scrubbed their skin with coarse bristles, believing the friction removed more than dirt. Manuals instructed them to focus on areas where desire supposedly manifested: across the shoulders, along the ribs, and over the chest. The sensation was sharp, sometimes painful, but the discomfort was the point. Pain symbolized effort, and effort symbolized moral clarity. The goal was not tenderness toward the body, but mastery over it. A man emerged from such routines, not refreshed but reassured that he had performed the necessary work of control. The washroom itself became an environment designed to prevent ease. Many kept the space sparse, with cold surfaces and minimal decoration. Light entered in thin, muted lines that revealed little warmth. Men positioned their basins where shadows fell, creating an atmosphere that discouraged lingering. Some even avoided sitting during bathing rituals, worried that comfort might loosen their discipline. In this controlled silence, each movement took on significance, reinforcing the belief that the bath was a test rather than a pleasure. Instructions for bathing expanded into broader behavioral expectations. Men were advised to maintain a steady heartbeat while washing, to restrain their breathing, and to avoid any gesture that suggested softness. The routine demanded precision. Water poured with care, soap applied without indulgence, fragrance added with restraint. Even drying oneself became part of the discipline, performed with firm, quick motions that discouraged any lingering sensation of warmth. The goal was to leave the washroom with the same composure one carried into formal gatherings. These practices seeped into everyday rhythms. A man rising before dawn often walked to his basin in silence, aware that the morning bath set the tone for the day. The cold air in the room reinforced the seriousness of the task. Before touching the water, he evaluated himself quietly. His thoughts, his posture, his sense of readiness. Only then did he begin the ritual. Some described the moment before immersion as the point where their fears and ambitions met, shaping how they would carry themselves through the hours that followed. Homes reinforced these routines by placing emphasis on the tools that supported them. Brushes, soaps, powders, and towels were arranged in exact order, as though proper placement helped maintain proper thought. Waste basins were cleaned with uncommon diligence, symbolizing the need to remove all traces of disorder. Even the sound of water pouring became part of the atmosphere, steady and unbroken, reminding men of the discipline they hoped to achieve. Families rarely questioned these habits because the values behind them were already deeply rooted. Men who struggled with these expectations often felt the weight of failure during bathing. If the cold water did not produce the intended sense of clarity, or if the brushing routine failed to silence certain thoughts, they interpreted these moments as personal shortcomings. They repeated steps, modified their routines, or extended the duration of the bath in hopes of regaining control. What should have been a moment of relief became a quiet confrontation with themselves. The washstand reflected not only their faces, but the standards they feared they could not meet. In many cases, bathing served as preparation for the scrutiny of others. A man believed that if he could suppress his body in private, he might better withstand the judgments of public life. The bath became a rehearsal, shaping how he would hold his shoulders, regulate his movements, or manage his breathing throughout the day. By treating the body as something to discipline at dawn, he hoped to avoid humiliation later. The ritual was both shield and burden. Over time, the purpose of bathing drifted far from its physical origins. The sharp bristles, the cold water, the rigid posture, all of it reflected a desire to sculpt the inner self by punishing the outer one. Men did not trust the body to behave without correction, and the bath became the place where this distrust played out with the greatest intensity. The more rigorously they performed these rituals, the more closely they aligned themselves with the standards society demanded. By the height of these practices, bathing no longer resembled a cleansing routine at all. It had transformed into a ritual of moral reinforcement, repeated not for comfort, but for reassurance. The body emerged clean, but the real objective lay in the sense of discipline the ritual was meant to produce. Men believed that without such routines, their inner nature might slip beyond their grasp. Everything in these routines revealed how bathing became a tool for shaping identity rather than maintaining health. A deeper strain soon formed as men began evaluating their worth through the discomfort they endured. In that demanding atmosphere, the simple act of washing shifted into a daily negotiation with fear itself. A faint patch beneath the arm of a shirt, barely visible in certain light, carried a weight far beyond its size. Men learned to watch for it with an attention that bordered on fear, aware that such a mark could undo the image they spent hours constructing. The stain itself represented something small and natural, yet within the expectations of the era. It signaled a loss of discipline. A man noticing the dampness spreading through the cloth felt a quiet jolt of shame, as though the body had spoken without permission. In that moment, the distance between outer control and inner uncertainty narrowed sharply. Clothing became both shield and enemy. Men layered fabrics deliberately, believing more material would hide what their bodies produced. 3 layers became common, not for warmth, but for concealment. The pressure of the garments pressed against the skin, creating a heightened awareness of each movement. They avoided raising their arms, shifting too quickly, or standing near sources of heat. Social interactions required careful posture, not to maintain elegance, but to prevent the slightest exposure of moisture. Clothing shaped their behavior as forcefully as any rulebook. Rooms with warm air or crowded gatherings generated immediate tension. Men positioned themselves near windows or at the edges of groups, seeking cooler drafts that promised safety. In formal settings, even a brief moment under bright lamps could feel threatening. A glance downward, a quick adjustment of the coat, a stiffening of the shoulders. These gestures appeared subtle to others, but reflected profound worry. The possibility of scent accompanying the stain made the fear sharper. Men imagined the moment when someone might lean slightly closer and interpret the dampness as evidence of weakness. Workplaces magnified the anxiety. In offices where reputation formed the basis of advancement, the stain took on symbolic power. Supervisors interpreted composure as competence, and competence required concealment of the body's responses. A man noticing moisture beneath his clothing felt his concentration fray. He offered shorter replies in conversation, kept his distance from colleagues, and avoided tasks requiring physical effort. Everything became an attempt to minimize risk. The stain, though hidden, shaped how he moved through the day. Households mirrored these concerns in quieter ways. Laundry routines expanded to include methods for bleaching underarm fabric, masking odor, and reinforcing seams weakened by constant cleaning. Men examined freshly washed shirts before wearing them, searching for shadows that might reappear when the heat returned. Servants learned to handle garments delicately, aware that their employer's standing depended on preservation of the illusion. Even in private spaces, the stain cast a long shadow over ordinary routines. Public transportation heightened the fear further. Carriages, trains, and trams forced men into proximity with strangers. The warmth of crowded spaces pressed against their clothing, encouraging moisture they could not control. They clutched handkerchiefs perfumed with cologne, pressing them lightly to the chest or neck to maintain the faint barrier of fragrance. The thought of standing too close to another passenger felt dangerous, not because of physical proximity, but because the body might reveal something unintended. Some men developed routines to prevent the stain from forming at all. They reduced movement throughout the day, practiced slower breathing to limit heat, and chose rigid postures designed to minimize friction. They avoided spicy foods, warm beverages, or exertion before important meetings. Diaries describe men waking before dawn to bathe in cold water, believing that lowered body temperature would delay the rise of sweat. These actions suggested survival strategies rather than grooming choices. The emotional strain deepened when men imagined others observing them. They pictured colleagues noticing a shift in fabric or acquaintances interpreting a subtle odor. Even when nothing was visible, fear alone altered their behavior. Conversations became shorter, laughter restrained, and gestures controlled. The stain became a symbol not merely of human function, but of vulnerability, something that might reveal a truth they worked tirelessly to conceal. In relationships, the pressure took on a different shape. Men hesitated before embracing loved ones, uncertain whether the contact might draw attention to areas of the body they wished to hide. Even in intimate settings, they monitored their clothing and maintained distance. The body no longer felt like a source of closeness, but a source of risk. Attempts at tenderness were filtered through caution, diminishing the ease that should have existed in private life. Paradoxically, the more they tried to prevent the stain, the more power it gained. The constant vigilance amplified awareness of the body's temperature, movement, and breath. A single damp patch carried an interpretation they feared they could not correct. It claimed a place in the imagination much larger than the fabric it touched. Men began to measure themselves against how well they avoided this symbol of imperfection. By the height of these concerns, a stain under the arm became a quiet accusation, proof, in the eyes of society, that discipline had faltered. Men prepared for this judgment every morning, layering clothing and applying fragrance with unwavering seriousness. They stepped into the world hoping their bodies would remain silent, aware that silence was the only protection from scrutiny. Everything in these fears revealed how much meaning a trace of moisture could hold in a world obsessed with restraint. A deeper unease soon formed as men realized that no amount of layering or discipline could fully silence their bodies. At that moment, the distance between dignity and dread began to narrow. A man feeling sweat gather beneath his clothing often reacted with a heaviness that had little to do with the heat around him. The moisture itself seemed harmless, yet the moment he sensed it, a quiet shame began to settle. He looked for the source of the discomfort and found it was not the sweat, but the meaning placed upon it. The era had taught him to interpret any hint of scent as a sign of failing, as though the body's natural functions carried moral weight. His response to his own skin became tangled with fear and self-judgment, shaping how he moved through the day. Many men described a sensation close to guilt when they noticed their bodies producing odors they could not fully control. They believed the scent pointed to some hidden flaw, something deeper than physical warmth or exertion. Moral literature reinforced that belief, linking strong smells to strong desires, and suggesting both revealed a lack of discipline. The connection formed quietly yet firmly, until men no longer separated physical reactions from moral ones. A simple moment of warmth became a moment of accusation. In certain households, the expectation of perfection grew more rigid. Men woke with the familiar awareness that their bodies needed to be managed before they interacted with the world. They washed carefully, dried themselves with measured attention, and inspected their clothing before stepping out. Still, there remained a small fear that something might escape their control. That fear stayed with them long after they left home. They checked their posture, controlled their breathing, and avoided unnecessary movement, hoping their bodies would remain quiet enough to avoid notice. Diaries from the period mention a form of self-reproach that emerged whenever scent entered a room. A man catching even a faint whiff of his own sweat often felt a sinking feeling in his chest. The reaction did not match the action. It was not the smell itself, but what it suggested to him. He anticipated judgment, even if no one else reacted. The internal voice condemned him first, painting the moment as evidence that he lacked restraint. In this way, guilt became a companion to the simplest physical experience. Social gatherings made the burden heavier. A man standing in a warm hall, surrounded by layers of clothing and candle-lit air, sensed the risk immediately. He adjusted his position, stepped back from conversations, and maintained a careful distance. Emotional discomfort blended with physical sensation, each amplifying the other. The thought that someone might detect a trace of scent grew into a quiet dread. It was not the body he feared, but the meaning others might attach to it. The language of moral advice reinforced these anxieties. Books warned that odor reflected inward disorder, even the possibility of moral weakness. Men read these lines repeatedly, absorbing the suggestion that the body's natural state required correction. They internalized the silence expected of them, believing any departure from it hinted at chaos beneath the surface. Each time they perspired, they imagined they had crossed an invisible line. The guilt that followed felt disproportionate, yet it returned consistently. Private moments offered little relief. Standing alone, a man touching the fabric beneath his arm or along his collar felt the familiar guilt rise again. He questioned why he produced scent at all, as though the body should obey a standard that never existed. Some tried to confront the feeling directly, but the culture offered few paths toward acceptance. Instead, they learned to hide their discomfort, layering clothing, applying fragrance, and avoiding situations that would challenge the illusion of control. Intimate relationships deepened the complexity. Men feared being close to those they cared about, not out of emotional hesitation but out of worry that their bodies might betray them. A moment of warmth between two people could become a moment of self-criticism. They pulled back subtly, hoping the distance would mask their insecurity. Partners noticed the hesitation but rarely understood its source. The weight of guilt lingered, even in environments where acceptance should have been easiest. This guilt was not loud or dramatic. It moved quietly, shaping decisions and habits. Men avoided physical activity not because they disliked it, but because they feared the consequences. They chose certain fabrics, altered their routines, and dismissed invitations that might lead to discomfort. Each adjustment reinforced the sense that their bodies required constant supervision. The belief grew until it overshadowed nearly every aspect of daily life. Over time, guilt turned into something deeper, a suspicion that the body itself could not be trusted. The men who lived through this period learned to view every sensation as a potential threat to their dignity. In their minds, a scent meant failure, and failure meant shame. The pressure to maintain an ideal of purity weighed heavily, leaving little space for ease or self-forgiveness. Everything in these confessions revealed how deeply shame had settled into the simple act of existing in one's own scent. A heavier silence formed as men realized how quickly a natural response of the body could turn into a moral wound. From that moment on, the boundary between fear and ritual began to thicken in the quiet of their most private spaces. They treated the bedroom as a place where scent had to be controlled with the same seriousness given to prayer. The quiet hours before sleep were filled with small, deliberate routines meant to keep the body from revealing anything it was not supposed to reveal. Many men carried bowls of steaming cloths infused with essential oils, letting the vapor drift across the bed as if it could cleanse the air of their own presence. The act was slow, almost ceremonial, a way of reassuring themselves that nothing too human would linger once they lay down. The bedding itself became a tool of concealment. Mattresses were sprinkled with powders that claimed to refresh the spirit, and blankets were soaked in perfumes strong enough to mask anything natural. A soft floral haze coated the room, its sweetness clinging to the walls and the fabric. These scents were chosen carefully. They had to be light enough to seem pure, yet powerful enough to override the smallest trace of sweat. Men often sat on the edge of the bed, waiting for the fragrance to settle before daring to lie down. The fear behind these rituals was quiet but constant. Many believed that their scent might rise during sleep, to betray them, or drift toward anyone who shared the room. Even a spouse could not be trusted to remain unbothered. To avoid this imagined humiliation, windows were kept open throughout the night. Even during the coldest months, fresh air was thought to dilute the body's odor, carrying it away before it could settle into the sheets. Some men slept wrapped tightly in their clothing, hoping the extra layers would hold in everything they did not wish to release. This nightly labor made rest feel less like comfort and more like a test of discipline. The goal was not relaxation but control. a final attempt to ensure that nothing about the body's natural state would emerge while consciousness was surrendered. The body was expected to behave even when the mind could no longer supervise it. In this environment, sleep became another frontier where self-surveillance continued without pause. The anxiety deepened when they imagined how easily scent could drift into silence and reveal something they could not manage. They feared waking to the thought that the perfume had faded, that the linen had failed, or that a trace of warmth had escaped into the room. The possibility itself was enough to unsettle them. They checked the air again and again, standing still at the bedside with a tense breath, waiting to see whether the scent they wished to erase would return. For many, the bedroom turned into a place where the struggle against the body felt most stark. The darkness made them more aware of what they could not see, and their own scent became an invisible threat. They layered the environment with fragrance in an attempt to create distance between themselves and their physical form. In doing so, they created a strange contradiction. The more they tried to hide their bodies, the more present those bodies felt, demanding attention through worry alone. These rituals were rarely questioned. They had become habits passed quietly between generations, reinforced by books, household advice, and social expectation. A man who did not prepare his bedroom in this way risked being seen as careless, undisciplined, or too comfortable with impulses considered dangerous. The bedroom, once a private space, became the final site where the moral performance of cleanliness continued long after the rest of the world had gone to sleep. The men who lived this way often convinced themselves that these practices made them stronger, cleaner, or more respectable. But beneath the surface was a gentler truth, one they rarely allowed themselves to acknowledge. The fear of being discovered through scent was not only about morality, it was about vulnerability. Nights were meant to soften a person, to let them rest, to allow the body to exist without judgment. Yet for many, the night was another arena where fear ruled, quiet but unyielding. Everything in these evening rituals revealed how rest transformed into another attempt to escape the body's quiet signals. A deeper strain formed as men realized that even sleep demanded vigilance against what they naturally released. Beneath that fragile calm, the next layer of conflict waited for them at dawn. A life built around artificial fragrance often began with a simple belief that the body could not be trusted to speak for itself. From early morning, men surrounded themselves with layers of scent meant to refine, soften, or completely overwrite whatever their skin naturally released. Cologne was dabbed behind the ears, powders pressed into collars, oils brushed lightly through the hair. These rituals were not expressions of luxury, they were acts of self-defense. A carefully constructed scent acted as a shield, forming a distance between the man and the world long before he stepped outside. The more this practice shaped daily routines, the easier it became to rely on it. A gentleman might pause at his mirror, aware that the soft aroma rising from his clothes felt more familiar than the body beneath. The fragrance was predictable, his own scent was not. That unpredictability carried risk. Risk of judgment, risk of misunderstanding, the risk of being seen as uncontrolled. Artificial fragrance promised safety. In choosing it, many men discovered a new form of detachment, though they rarely admitted it openly. Over time, this detachment grew sharper. Some men described a strange emptiness, a sense that their natural scent had become foreign to them. The more perfume they used, the more distant that original scent felt. When the fragrance began to fade in the late hours of the day, a quiet panic often followed, as if the self they presented to the world had begun to dissolve. Reapplication became a reflex, almost a reassurance, a quick way to rebuild the version of themselves considered acceptable. Moments without fragrance carried an unexpected weight. A warm afternoon, a crowded room, or a missed morning routine could bring the natural scent of the body back to the surface. Many interpreted this return as failure, even danger. They hurried to hide it again, convinced that anyone who noticed would question their refinement. The body's quiet signals, sweat, warmth, scent, were reframed as flaws. Evidence of impulses society demanded them to suppress. Messages reinforcing this fear came from every direction. Advice manuals insisted that discipline began with scent. Advertisements promised purity through bottled fragrances. Social rules rewarded men who smelled controlled, composed, and elegantly artificial. Natural scent was framed as something coarse, the mark of a man who had not yet mastered himself. In that climate, authenticity felt reckless. Every instinct nudged them toward concealment. As these expectations hardened, fragrance became a second skin. A man moving through a dinner party or a workplace often sensed that the scent around him was doing more of the speaking than he was. It shaped impressions, defined interactions, and overshadowed the warmth of his own presence. This distance seeped quietly into personal relationships as well. Leaning close to a loved one no longer felt intimate. It felt revealing. Risky. Vulnerable. Many kept physical and emotional space simply to maintain the barrier their fragrance provided. Yet, despite the emptiness that occasionally surfaced, the idea of returning to a natural state felt impossible. The consequences loomed too large. Raised eyebrows, quiet judgments, assumptions about hygiene or morality. Reclaiming one's own scent required a kind of courage that society did not reward. A man who abandoned artificial fragrance risked being seen as careless or unrefined. Acceptance hinged on maintaining silence. Not just silence in behavior, but silence in scent. Approval strengthened the cycle. A pleasantly scented man gained trust more easily, was treated as polished and reliable, and avoided suspicion or ridicule. In a world obsessed with control, fragrance became a symbol of discipline. Men wore it not because it reflected who they were, but because it hid what they feared others would see. Slowly, their identities bent toward the fragrance that surrounded them, while the person beneath receded into the background. By the time this routine solidified into a habit, many no longer questioned it. Artificial scent was not just a preference, it had become part of their existence. The quiet ache of distance from their own bodies persisted, but there was no language to express it safely. It was easier to maintain the polished surface than to confront the unsettling truth underneath, that the effort to appear refined had created a life lived beside oneself rather than within one's own skin. Everything in this ritual revealed how deeply men feared the return of their natural scent. A heavier reliance on artificial fragrance soon clouded the lines between identity and performance. In that growing haze, the self they tried so hard to protect began to slip further out of reach. Pressure to appear perfectly controlled reshaped the way many men understood their own bodies. Every detail, scent, movement, and warmth was monitored as though it might reveal something unacceptable. Cleanliness no longer meant hygiene. It became a measure of discipline, a test of how completely a man could silence the traces of human life that clung to him, no matter how hard he tried to erase them. By the time these standards hardened, the body beneath the clothing felt less like something lived in and more like something managed, polished, and corrected. Expectations followed men from childhood into adulthood. A young man quickly learned that respect depended on how little of himself he allowed others to sense. His natural scent had to be concealed, his breath softened by mint or herbs, his skin powdered to remove any hint of moisture. Failure in any of these details suggested weakness or lack of refinement. As a result, he carried himself not with ease but with vigilance, aware that acceptance depended on constant performance. This vigilance seeped into the simplest parts of daily life. Morning routines resembled rituals of suppression, scented cloths pressed against the chest, oils brushed onto hair, crisp collars secured so tightly they restricted breath. These practices created a surface so carefully composed that the body underneath felt increasingly distant. where other eras embraced the warm reality of living skin. This one celebrated the illusion of something untouched, unblemished, artificially pure. Distance shaped their understanding of intimacy. Touching one's own skin could feel strange, even unwelcome, as though the body no longer belonged to the person inhabiting it. Many admitted, quietly, if at all, that they had forgotten the simple comfort of feeling their own warmth without judgment. Touch that should have grounded them, instead, brought discomfort. A reminder that the natural self contradicted everything society demanded. Relationships felt the effects of this detachment. A man lying beside someone he loved often maintained a small but deliberate distance, fearing that closeness might reveal the scent or softness he struggled to hide. Even in the dark, with no one watching, he worried about maintaining composure. His presence became something curated rather than shared, something presented rather than lived. Intimacy required vulnerability, yet vulnerability had been framed as failure. Emotional detachment followed physical detachment. Suppressing scent meant suppressing instinct. Suppressing instinct muted emotion. Men moved through their days with a tight, careful calm that left no room for feeling. Many carried an unspoken heaviness. Not dramatic, but persistent. A quiet ache formed by the distance between who they were and who they believed they had to appear to be. In the attempt to appear composed, they drifted further from themselves. Society rewarded this drift. Those who mastered the scentless ideal were praised as disciplined, respectable, and dignified. Approval fueled repetition. The more a man concealed his humanity, the more he was celebrated for it. By contrast, those who showed even the smallest sign of natural scent faced judgment. Whispers circulated quickly. Respect eroded. The consequences ensured that few dared to challenge the standard. Every gesture became part of this silent performance. A handshake required careful preparation. A conversation required physical distance. A walk through a crowded room demanded attention to posture, breath, and heat. The man who lived within these rules became fluent in self-erasure. He knew how to move without drawing attention, how to stand without appearing warm, how to present himself as though carved from something stable and unscented. Over time, the body ceased to feel like a companion and instead felt like an obstacle. Clothing was designed not for comfort, but for containment. The air felt too close unless filtered through fragrances and powders. The body's natural impulses, sweat, warmth, and scent, were treated like flaws to be corrected. Living inside such a shell bred confusion. How could a man trust himself when every instinct he carried had been labeled inappropriate? The deeper consequence was subtle but profound. The memory of being fully alive began to fade. Moments of genuine embodiment. Warmth after exertion. Softness during rest. Closeness in affection. Became rare. Men lived beside their bodies, not within them. The loss was not dramatic, but steady, shaping a life where identity felt hollow, suspended between expectation and performance. This transformation did not strengthen them, it fractured them. The attempt to become odorless, emotionless, perfectly controlled, created a constant tension beneath the surface. Many sensed something missing but could not articulate it, because the language of their world allowed no room for acknowledging the body as something worth embracing. The ideal demanded silence. No scent, no softness, no sign of the person underneath. Everything in this transformation revealed how men gradually surrendered their humanity to maintain an illusion of purity. A deeper stillness rose quietly as their bodies became places they no longer fully recognized. From that stillness, a quiet question began pressing against the edges of their carefully composed selves. Emotional distance began to settle into the lives of many men long before they were aware of it. A lifetime spent suppressing scent, warmth, and instinct gradually reshaped the way they related to themselves. The body became something monitored rather than inhabited, corrected rather than understood. When a man spent years treating his natural presence as a flaw, the ability to feel at ease within his own skin slowly dissolved, leaving behind a persistent sense of unease he struggled to name. This unease showed itself most clearly in moments of intimacy. Touch that should have carried comfort often felt awkward or alarming, as though contact risked revealing something he had spent years trying to hide. Many men moved through relationships with a kind of guarded restraint, careful not to lean too close, breathe too warmly, or allow their scent to linger on another person. Affection, which relied on closeness, became something he performed rather than felt. The emotional connection behind it dimmed, replaced by a practiced politeness that kept vulnerability at a distance. The feeling of being wrong in one's own body crept into daily life as well. A man might notice a bead of sweat or a sudden warmth in his chest and feel a flash of shame before anything else. Such reactions were not dramatic, but constant. Shame works slowly, threading itself through routines, gestures, and thoughts until it shaped the entire emotional landscape of adulthood. Over time, this quiet shame became a companion, weakening the ability to experience joy without second-guessing oneself. A deeper heaviness often followed. Men who lived in constant fear of being noticed began to absorb that fear into their understanding of who they were. The idea that something inside them, something natural, human, uncontrollable, was unacceptable, took root. This belief fed a low, persistent sadness, the kind that did not overwhelm, but lingered through months or years. Many mistook it for tiredness or age, never realizing that it was the emotional cost of distancing themselves from their own bodies. Relationships are strained under this weight. Some men withdrew from romantic connections altogether, choosing solitude, not out of preference, but out of fear. The risk of being physically close to someone, of being touched, smelled, or truly seen, felt too great. Solitude became a refuge from potential judgment, but it also deepened the sense of isolation. A life spent avoiding intimacy inevitably blurred the ability to express emotion at all. This emotional numbness revealed itself in subtle ways. Conversations felt thinner, laughter felt practiced, and silence felt safer than any attempt to speak honestly. Men became skilled at presenting a calm, composed surface, while burying everything raw or uncertain. To those around them, this restraint looked like maturity. In reality, it was a thinning of the emotional world, a reduction of the self into something manageable, predictable, and nearly silent. Physical symptoms accompanied this silence. Many men lived with tension in their shoulders, tightness in their chest, or a constant pressure in their throat. These sensations were rarely acknowledged. Acknowledging them required acknowledging the body, and the body was something they had been taught to distrust. Instead, they carried the tension forward, assuming it was part of being alive rather than a response to years of self-denial. Social interactions contributed to the problem. Expressions of vulnerability were often met with discomfort or dismissal. A man who admitted feeling anxious or insecure risked being seen as weak. The fear of judgment encouraged further withdrawal. Over time, many learned to confide in no one. Not partners, not friends, not even themselves. The distance between their thoughts and their words widened until honesty felt like a foreign language. In this climate, emotional intimacy became rare, even when a connection was possible. Many men found themselves unable to relax into it. Their bodies felt untrustworthy. Their emotions felt risky. Attempts at closeness were overshadowed by the fear of revealing too much. The result was a quiet longing that never settled, a yearning for warmth that remained just out of reach. Yet, beneath these layers of restraint, the human need for connection persisted. Some men sensed the loss but could not articulate what exactly had slipped away. The difficulty lay not in identifying the emotion, but in recognizing its source. A lifetime of being told that the body must be silenced had taught them to silence the heart as well. By the time they understood this, the distance felt too wide to cross. This form of emotional isolation was not dramatic, but it shaped the foundations of their lives. Choices about love, marriage, friendship, and even self-expression were filtered through a fear they could never fully escape. The cost of appearing controlled was the slow erosion of feeling alive. Everything in this inward struggle revealed how deeply men had been conditioned to separate themselves from their own bodies. A heavier ache gathered quietly as emotional distance settled into the rhythm of their days. Out of that ache emerged the earliest shadows of what such disconnection would eventually cost them. Expectations that once governed Victorian streets did not disappear. They lingered quietly, reshaped into the routines of modern life. Many men today begin their mornings with the same sense of vigilance their predecessors carried, checking, masking, and correcting any trace of scent before stepping into the world. The language has changed. The bottles are sleeker, and the advertisements brighter. Yet the underlying message remains familiar. The body is not to be trusted unless it is silenced. This pressure appears in the smallest gestures. A man reaching for deodorant does so not only for freshness, but for reassurance, as though the absence of scent could guarantee respectability. Marketing reinforces this belief with a confidence that borders on command. Products promise strength, control, dominance, words that echo older fears, disguised in modern vocabulary. The body's warmth is described as a problem. Sweat is framed as a flaw. Natural scent becomes something to eliminate, not understand. Such messages slip into the subconscious long before a man realizes they have taken root. He may find himself checking his shirt, adjusting his collar, or stepping back during conversation to maintain distance. These habits feel practical, even responsible, but they often mask a deeper discomfort. The instinct to hide the body persists across generations, surviving not as tradition, but as quiet inheritance. What once shaped Victorian men now shapes their descendants. Though few pause to question the origin, technology has only amplified this expectation. The modern world offers endless ways to cover, refine, or erase scent. Soaps promise purity, sprays promise absolute dryness, and colognes promise transformation. Each product carries the same unspoken implication. Your natural state is insufficient. Men purchase these items in search of security. Yet the need for constant reinforcement reveals how fragile that security truly is. This fragility reveals itself in social interactions as well. Many men feel uneasy in crowded spaces, worried that a moment of warmth or exertion might betray them. Others hesitate during intimacy, fearing that their natural scent will be judged harshly. Even solitude does not always bring relief. The internal voice, shaped by years of conditioning, whispers criticism before anyone else has the chance to. Shame becomes a quiet companion, shaping daily life without ever announcing its presence. The emotional toll builds slowly. A man may notice a tightening in his chest before entering a room, or a brief hesitation when removing a jacket. These moments may seem insignificant, but together they form a pattern of self-monitoring that leaves little space for ease. When an entire culture frames natural scent as failure, the very act of existing in one's own skin becomes a negotiation. Men learn to anticipate judgment before it arrives. Cultural norms deepen the divide. Compliments often reinforce artificial fragrance. You smell clean. You smell sharp, rarely acknowledging the person beneath. Negative reactions to natural scent, even mild ones, carry far more weight. A single comment can shape years of self-perception. The body becomes something to manage rather than inhabit, and emotional distance follows physical discomfort. Many men drift away from themselves without noticing the shift. Modern advertising capitalizes on this vulnerability. Campaigns use bold language, promising to eliminate odor instantly or destroy unwanted scent. These phrases echo Victorian fears with unsettling precision. The idea that the body is flawed persists, dressed in contemporary aesthetics but rooted in the same old insecurities. Men are encouraged not to understand their scent but to overpower it, not to accept themselves but to correct themselves. This cycle continues because it offers a convenient illusion of control. When life feels uncertain, grooming routines provide structure, yet beneath that structure lies a tension that never fully disappears. A man may feel confident while surrounded by artificial fragrance, but that confidence often cracks the moment the scent fades. Feeling whole becomes dependent on conditions outside oneself. Despite these pressures, the human body continues to speak. Its warmth rises. Its scent shifts. Its instincts surface. These signals are not flaws but reminders of existence. Reminders many men have been taught to distrust. Learning to accept them requires unlearning generations of quiet rules. Such unlearning is slow, subtle, and often uncomfortable, but it marks one of the few paths toward genuine connection with oneself. Signs of change appear gradually. Conversations about body acceptance, mental health, and authenticity have begun to challenge older beliefs. Some men experiment with lighter routines, using fewer layers of deodorants or colognes. Others question why certain expectations exist at all. Yet these shifts remain fragile, easily overshadowed by the louder voices of tradition and marketing. Progress is uneven, but its presence matters. Even with these shifts, many still struggle to embrace the idea that natural scent has value. The fear of being judged persists, shaped by centuries of cultural conditioning. Accepting one's own scent requires a kind of courage that feels deeply unfamiliar. For men taught to distrust their bodies, trust becomes an act of quiet rebellion. Everything in these lingering pressures revealed how deeply the past continues to shape the present. A slow awakening has begun, as men recognize the gap between who they are and who they were told to be. Out of that realization rises the possibility that reclaiming the body's truth may be the first step toward reclaiming themselves. Behind every polished fragrance that marked a man as refined, respectable, or controlled, another truth waited quietly, one he rarely allowed himself to acknowledge: the pursuit of perfect scent, which once seemed like a small act of social duty, gradually became a way of hiding from the world and from himself. What began as a daily routine grew into a habit of self-erasure, a slow drifting away from the natural signals the body tried to send. Over time, the man who smelled correct to everyone else could no longer recognize his own presence, as though the scent he wore had taken his place. This disconnection formed layer by layer. A man learned to avoid the warmth of his skin because warmth might produce scent. He learned to step cautiously in public, careful not to breathe too deeply, move too quickly, or press too close to others. His body no longer felt like a home. It felt like a liability he had to manage. And the fragrance he applied each morning settled over that unease like a polished shell, admired from the outside but hollow within. In quiet moments, when the artificial scent had faded and the world was still, a different realization sometimes surfaced. Beneath the layers of deodorant, perfumi, and ritual, an emptiness pulsed faintly, an ache for something unfiltered, for the lost familiarity of his own skin. The body he had spent years silencing had not disappeared, it had only retreated, waiting for a moment when he might dare to acknowledge it again. Yet the thought of stepping toward that honesty carried fear. He had been taught too thoroughly that the natural self was dangerous. For many, this fear shaped their emotional lives as sharply as their physical ones. Men who could not accept their own scent struggled to take their own feelings. Vulnerability smelled too much like exposure. Warmth felt risky. Desire felt unpredictable. The instinct to hide the body soon became the instinct to hide the heart. and so they lived behind carefully arranged expressions, using composure the way they used fragrance. Something refined enough to be shown to the world. Something controlled enough to avoid scrutiny. This restraint came at a cost few recognized until it was too late. A man who feared being noticed, physically, often feared being noticed emotionally. He learned to share just enough to appear open, but never enough to be truly known. The fear of scent became a metaphor for the fear of self. If the body could betray him, perhaps feelings could too. Silence grew easier than honesty. Distance easier than closeness. Even pleasure became complicated. Moments of intimacy, rest, or warmth should have offered ease. But instead, they exposed the gap between the man he presented and the man he was. Many found themselves unable to fully relax, even in private. A glance toward the mirror, the faint rustle of fabric, or the fading of perfume at the end of the day could rupture the illusion. What remained was not joy, but tension. Subtle, constant, shaping the rhythm of daily life. This tension extended into the spaces where men sought comfort. In bedrooms, the rituals of masking continued long after lamps were extinguished. Scented linens softened the air. Windows stayed open even on cold nights. Bottles of fragrance sat within reach on bedside tables. The room felt prepared, curated, almost ceremonial, yet never fully intimate. A place designed for rest became a stage for the same quiet vigilance carried through the day. The world outside encouraged this vigilance. Advertisements insisted that modern life demanded freshness, control, and absolute suppression of natural scent. Friends offered compliments when the fragrance was particularly sharp or effective, reinforcing the belief that the body needed correction before it could be acceptable. Every message echoed the same idea Victorian men had once lived by, that purity was not about health or morality, but about hiding anything human. Still, beneath these expectations, a different truth persisted. No matter how thoroughly a man masked himself, the body continued to speak. Sweat formed, warmth rose, scent shifted. The body reminded him, again and again, that he was alive. These reminders were not failures but invitations, gentle signals urging him to return to something real. Yet many brushed them aside, afraid to uncover what they had built, their lives avoiding. The cost of this avoidance grew quietly. The man who spent decades suppressing scent often found himself suppressing emotion, desire, and even identity. Feelings that should have guided him instead dissolved into uncertainty. He struggled to understand himself because he had spent years hiding from the simplest truth of his own existence. What remained was a life performed rather than lived, polished but fragile, orderly but empty. History kept repeating in subtle ways. The same fears that once haunted Victorian men continued to hover in the modern world. Refined in language, softened in tone, but unchanged at their core. Bottles of cologne lined shelves as reminders of how deeply the past shaped the present. Each contained not just fragrance, but a fragment of the old belief that being acceptable required disappearing. It is unsettling to consider how easily these ideas survived. Entire generations grew up believing that scent was shameful, that the body must be hidden, that authenticity was too risky to show. A culture obsessed with cleanliness created men who struggled to recognize their own worth beyond the fragrance they wore. And still, in small ways, the pattern continued. Quiet, persistent, woven through morning routines and social expectations alike. Yet even within this pattern, hope remained possible. Some men began to question why they feared their own scent, why they apologized for their bodies, and why they trusted perfume more than presence. The act of questioning was small but significant. It marked the beginning of remembering that the body was never the enemy. That warmth was not weakness. That scent was not shame. That humanity was something to live in, not hide from. To reclaim the body meant reclaiming emotion as well. The man who dared to breathe deeply without fear, who allowed his scent to exist, who stopped correcting himself long enough to listen. Such a man stepped slowly back into his own life. The journey was not easy, but it was real, and real things, unlike polished surfaces, have weight. The story of being too fragrant was never truly about hygiene. It was about identity lost beneath layers of expectation. It was about fear disguised as elegance. It was about the painful cost of believing that the truest parts of oneself must be hidden to be loved. Everything in this long history revealed how men learned to avoid their own bodies in the hope of being accepted. A deeper truth rose quietly, that the more they erased themselves, the further they drifted from what made them human. Out of that drift came the loneliness that lingered through decades, and the longing for a life lived without fear of being real. And now, as the fragrance fades and the night grows still, I want to thank you for staying with this story. May your own rest be gentle. May your breath come softly, and may your sleep arrive without judgment or worry. Just the quiet weight of being alive. Good night. From Sleepy History Tales, I